Renewed efforts for a negotiated, comprehensive and sustainable settlement are needed. The EU fully supports the OSCE Minsk group led by its co-chairs, and we stand ready to contribute in the shaping of a durable and comprehensive settlement, including through support for stabilisation and confidence-building measures. I thank you.
Herzlichen Dank, Frau Kommissarin.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. That brings to an end this debate. The vote will be held today. The next debate on the agenda is the situation in Haiti. First of all, I'd like to give the floor to the authors. First of all, Mr. Kelly, for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. There is a crisis in Haiti at the moment, a political, humanitarian, security crisis. There was to be a general election in 2019. It hasn't happened yet. President Moïse is still in office, in spite of the fact that his mandate ended in February. The people of Haiti are worried, as is the international community, concerning a referendum that is to be run in Haiti during the summer. For the last couple of months, thousands of people in Haiti have been protesting against this referendum and about the president's mandate. Violence is often being used against them. Since there is no transparency or democracy in this referendum, the European Union has made the right decision not to provide funding and not to send observers. The country has other massive problems: the coronavirus, criminal gangs, kidnapping, and even child slavery. I am imploring the authorities of Haiti to take the necessary steps to deal with these very serious problems. Thank you, President.
Next.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Haider for 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam President, Madam Commissioner. Haiti at the moment is not just in one crisis, they're in several crises which are interlinked and which fan the flames of each other. After the earthquake in January 2020, the country still hasn't recovered. On the contrary, it is slipping, pushed by the very worrying political developments towards an existential crisis. And if that weren't enough, for more than a year now, we've had the COVID pandemic, which is strafing the already suffering country. Human rights are on the agenda here. Food insecurity has almost doubled over the last year. Around 4 million of the overall 11 million Haitians are suffering from hunger. Then you have a political crisis on top of that, with a corrupt political elite who have left behind the rule of law. Elections are arbitrarily changed. President Moïse has been has held on to power, refusing to step down and avoiding the mainstay of a democratic society by doing so. We should bring to an end violence in Haiti. All violations of human rights must be stopped, and those who are responsible have to be taken to justice. There needs to be independent democratic structures which are constructed. The citizens of Haiti have to be given the right to free, fair and transparent elections. That should not be taken away from them. The European Union has to do its utmost to make sure that aid funding should get to those who need it most, i.e. to the people who are lacking everything as it is at the moment.
Next.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Ms. Loiseau for 1.5 minutes.
$10 billion. That's what donors have put on the table after the earthquake that hit Haiti in 2010. It's a huge amount of money. But what trace has this money left on the lives of ordinary Haitians? Well, pretty much no trace at all. Today in Haiti, people don't live, they survive. They are faced with insecurity and armed gangs. A few weeks ago, these gangs kidnapped clergy that had spent their lives helping the Haitian population. The political class in Haiti has tragically failed. The Haitian president is currently ruling by decree. It's preparing a referendum which we cannot support and has announced elections without having put the conditions in place for them to take place peacefully. As long as these conditions are not complied with, the European Union cannot provide support nor send observers to such uncertain elections. But the failure of Haiti is a collective failure. No one, not the NGOs, not the international donors, not the European Union, none of us can be proud of the situation of crisis that is a total crisis, political, economic, social, security crisis that the country is faced with, and which is having repercussions on the region, particularly on the French overseas territories. We need to buck up before Haiti collapses completely.
Als nächstes hält das Wort die Kollegin Rose, 1 Minute.
Now, Ms. Rose, for 1.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President. Haiti is a country that's collapsing from a political, social, humanitarian and health perspective. Rarely has a country been governed by such a pack of incompetents and criminals. People's daily lives are full of death, insecurity, corruption. The country is so unstable that many criminal gangs are in charge of different districts in the cities, kidnapping innocent citizens every year, hundreds of them. For too long, Haitians have ceased to have any faith in their government or their president, Jovenel Moïse, who cannot meet the basic needs of the population. So what can we do to ensure that rule of law, democracy and human rights are respected in Haiti? We can't sit back and watch. We can't be too timid when it comes to Jovenel Moïse trying to hang on to power. In staying silent, international powers are working hand in hand with this government that is forcing food insecurity and violence on the people of Haiti. We have a stake in this. We are partly responsible for this, and we must not forget what Haiti's people are going through. We must take a strong stance against Jovenel Moïse and his government. We must work with organizations who are calling for democratic stability in the country. And this resolution is very meaningful given the upcoming constitutional referendum in June. Now, this is a constitutional referendum that the President wants to see take place because it would concentrate power in his hands. But we need free, fair, transparent elections in Haiti. And we call on the European Union and the international community to support Haiti in that endeavour. No country is facing a situation as complex as Haiti, and it is our responsibility to listen to what Haiti's people want and take action now. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Als nächstes spricht die Kollegin.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Wisniewska. 1 minute.
Madam Chair, Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. 59% of the population of Haiti is living in poverty. 70% of Haitian children are not going to school. A common practice in Haiti is rest-a-back. In last term, we had a resolution to protect these children who are suffering from this modern slavery. Now, we have one more resolution about Haiti, and the situation there is even worse than before. More violence, rape, massacres, murder, which is all this is done by armed gangs, which are only a transparent, clear election process may stop the political crisis in Haiti. The European Union has allocated funds for the support of the weak in Haiti, but we should make sure that this help reaches those who really need it. So this is why it is justified to make a report by the European Court of Audits concerning this spending of the European funds in Haiti, especially in the context of corruption. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Matias, 1 minute 30. Thank you very much, Madam President. The situation in Haiti is absolutely tragic. It's a profound political crisis combined with a humanitarian crisis. President Moïse's attempts to hold on to power at all costs have led to situations of state violence and a difficult situation for those who are struggling for democracy. There have been kidnappings, rapes and massacres. In Haiti, the poverty rate is growing. A huge proportion of the population lives below the poverty line. Education doesn't reach all children. The active population is mostly illiterate, and thousands of children are not going to school. There's food insecurity. 4 million people don't manage to have a decent amount of food. This is linked to Hurricane Laura last year, but also to the pandemic, which has been badly dealt with by the president. The situation in Haiti is terrible, so we call for full solidarity with the population of Haiti, providing the necessary resources for these people to live in dignity. The European Court of Auditors needs to help to guarantee that the funds that are earmarked actually get down to the population rather than to the corrupt elites. We also condemn the holding of this, which is illegal. But we cannot forget the tragic situation of the Haitian people, which we have to support without reserve.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. And I welcome the High Representative Joseph Borrell. I'd like to thank you very much for being with us today. The next speaker will be Carlos Sorinho on behalf of the S&D Group for 1 minute. Madam President, Commissioner, in Haiti, we've seen a wave of popular protests since the president declared that he would hold on to power for yet another year and hold a constitutional reform referendum. The extension of the mandate is based on an interpretation of the constitution that is contested by legal experts and the opposition, who consider that the mandate of the president is over and he's been governing by decree since January last year after having dissolved parliament. This referendum is a violation of the constitution of the country, which says that all referendums to amend the constitution are forbidden. Together with the political instability, Haiti is also on the verge of a sanitary, social and an economic crisis. I call upon the authorities of Haiti to restore the rule of law, to respect fundamental rights and democracy, to hold presidential, legislative and local elections that are free and fair within this year. Democracy is the basis for social peace, and it is the lever for something that the people of Haiti have been waiting for too long, and that they deserve sooner rather than later.
Dank.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Bijou for 1 minute.
Okay. Spricht für die Renew-Fraktion.
Speaking on behalf of the Renew Group.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, nobody should be pointing the finger or stigmatizing a man, a woman or a child who's been forced to leave their country to flee misery and violence. But everybody has to mobilize their efforts if behind these migratory flows you find trafficking in human beings. Yes, Haiti might be a long way from Brussels, but in this area of the world, there are many European territories close by, including French territories. And in the Caribbean, all the way to French Guiana, we've always shown solidarity. And we know that the emergencies that we see today require efficiency and coherence from us. Yes, we have to assure ourselves that if we show that we are thinking of the people, that can also help. But we have to look at the violent crises and what impact that has on French Guiana, the border there. There are thousands of Haitians who are trying to get there to claim asylum. We cannot allow this European territory alone to face this Haitian crisis. The French government is acting. Europe has to act as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Pignedoli for 1 minute.
Buongiorno a tutti.
Good morning, everyone. Haiti is a very poor country that has been battered by disastrous natural disasters and the pandemic. But the social and political situation is no better. And it's very worrying to see the level of violence and impunity in the country, which is held hostage by armed groups, some of which are protected by President Moïse. It's important for the European Union to use its diplomatic and persuasive powers to work with the international community and the new American president to stop the escalation of violence and the democratic backsliding that has affected the country. We need to take a firm stance against the attempts to change the Haitian constitution to concentrate power in the hands of President Moïse. It's important to guarantee new elections, to safeguard the work that's already been done to try and bolster democracy. The European Union has to maintain economic support for the country, but it must demand respect for fundamental rights. Thank you very much.
Danke sehr. Nächster Redner.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Lopez for 1 minute.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, President. The situation that Haiti is going through is absolutely shocking. 70% of the population living under the poverty line, people going through hunger and a perpetual economic crisis that have now been worsened by the effects of the hurricane and the pandemic. What's more, the country is now also facing a serious political crisis, with President Moïse trying to do his best to hold on to power. And Haiti's people have done their best to protest this state of affairs. They're also facing the situation of institutional violence in their country, and so we call on Haiti to guarantee its citizens' rights and their legitimate right to protest in particular. We call for the separation of powers in the country and an end to the constitutional conflict. And we want to see free and transparent elections in Haiti as soon as possible that will ensure that the country can regain its stability. We also want to keep using the instruments at our disposal in terms of cooperation and development so that the island can improve the shocking humanitarian situation that's going through. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Die Debatte beschließt die Kollegin Bilbao Barandika.
Mrs. Bilbao Barandika will close the debate for 1 minute.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, President. Commissioner. The poverty, destitution, desperation, the radical lack of expectations of any kind of future that is afflicting the population of Haiti is the main cause of the political crisis in the country today. That's why I support the appeals to action in this resolution to restore the country's electoral schedule and resolve the constitutional conflict, as well as the efforts to put an end to the repression and violence carried out by criminal gangs in Haiti. But the first condition for the democracy and the values of peace in the country are able to take root is a deep shift, an economic and social shift in the country, and that requires external aid. The lever that could really transform the situation is social justice, and it requires aid to development, a social economy, and proper distribution of wealth. This obliges us to guarantee that all European businesses operating in Haiti will apply the Union's and implement the Union's values in their activities, and we must comply with international asylum law to welcome those fleeing persecution. And that is why I do not agree with paragraph 16 of this resolution. Thank you.
Danke sehr. Und dann erhält nun für die Kommission.
Thank you very much. Now on behalf of the Commission, the High Representative, Mr. Borrell.
Mr. President,
honourable members of the European Parliament, certainly the situation in Haiti is, as many of you have described in your interventions. In recent months, kidnappings for ransoms, attacks by criminal gangs against their rivals on the neighborhoods, widespread insecurity have increased in Haiti in a context of almost total impunity. In parallel, political tensions are resurfacing due to, once again, disputes over the timing and scope of a referendum on constitutional reform and of the elections proposed by the government. This electoral process has created a lot of trouble and increased political tensions. We, at the European Union, we have been following with a lot of attention and concern the current political and social crisis and its negative effects on the security situations on the everyday life of Haitians. Certainly, the persistent insecurity, growing poverty and structural inequalities in Haiti, together with increasing political tensions, may lead to a pattern of public discontent that will be followed by violence, police repression, and other human rights violations. It's very much worrying to observe an increasing radicalization of political stances, the worsening of a humanitarian crisis, and the increase in gang-related violence, with a high number of killings in poor neighborhoods of the capital. We have urged the authorities to conduct effective and thorough investigations into these crimes. An inclusive political dialogue between all the forces of Haiti in order to find an agreement on the conditions necessary for the organization of such credible and democratic elections that will meet the aspirations of the people. And happily, we had to announce on the last 6th of May that the European Union would neither finance nor send observers for the referendum on the new constitutions. On that situation, it is essential that the authorities provide safety and security for their citizens while respecting the rule of law and international human rights principles, which are crucial for Haiti's stability and development. We will keep monitoring developments in Haiti, and we will insist on the need to respect the rule of law and human rights. The European Union stands by the Haiti population, but the political class and the government need to understand that they have to become serious about basic economic and social reforms if they want to count on our continued support. In this context, the time is ripe for the development of a wider scale of EU public diplomacy in the field of human rights in Haiti, in accordance with the principles of the Cotonou Agreement and the European Union Global Human Rights Strategy for 2024. Thank you very much for your contribution through your debate and resolutions. Thank you.
Herzlichen Dank. Die Aussprache.
Thank you very much. That concludes this debate. The vote will take place tomorrow. The next item on today's agenda is the situation in Chad. The authors will get the floor first. The first is our colleague Mrs. Zovko for 1 minute 30.
Madam President, High Representative, Chad is a key country for the security and stability in the Sahel and important partner of the European Union in the fight against terrorism in the region. 66% of the people live in severe poverty and more than 400,000 citizens are internally displaced. The turmoil that emerged after the death of President Deby describes the fragility of the political situation in the country. I call on the National Council of Transition to respect its own declarations and to work towards free and fair elections. The people of Chad deserves a civilian government based on the principles of democracy and human rights. The European Union has to support Chad in these efforts towards democracy. At the same time, we need to reaffirm our support for Chad's commitment in the G5 Sahel. We should remain determined to assist Chad and the wider Sahel on its road towards stabilisation and recovery. Yet this support cannot be fully effective unless there is a strong governance and ownership. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Als nächster spricht die Kollegin.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Marie Arena. 1 minute 30.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, President, High Representative. The people of Chad have been left behind in seeking out stability in the Sahel. Chad has become a country where all socio-economic indicators are red. Corruption and impunity have been institutionalized. And Chad is a major stakeholder in fighting insecurity in the region, in partnership with the other G5 members and supported by French operations and European aid. But the social insecurity in the country is huge, and if this were to implode, there would be disastrous consequences for the region. The mass boycott of the elections was already a sign of deep discontent that could completely cause the country to collapse. Since February 2021, people have been calling out against of this election, and there were weekly protests, the peak of which took place in April, both in terms of the number of people at the protests and the repression they faced. Chadians wanted real change, particularly for young people, most of whom can't read, who are hungry and who are easy prey for mercenaries, armed movements or jihadis. And broadly speaking, Chadians want inclusive dialogue, peaceful dialogue, leading to free, fair, democratic, transparent elections. The inclusive national conference that they are calling for ought to be able to take place freely, and the Military Transition Council must ensure that there's as broad participation as possible, with freedom for all to take part, including those who disagree with that Military Transition Council. Violent repression is not the solution, and that is why we firmly condemn the repression of the CMT against peaceful protesters, and we call for independent inquiries into this matter. What's more, the European Union supports the people of Chad, but must guarantee that the means being provided will not fund actions that violate human rights. Thank you.
Dankeschön. Als nächstes spricht.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Ertjen, 1 minute 30.
Thank you very much, Madam President, in French. Ladies and gentlemen, Chad is an important partner for the European Union in its fight against terrorism. That's already been said by a number of previous speakers. And it should also be mentioned that Chad itself has suffered since 2015 attacks by Boko Haram. This resolution has not been drawn up to point the finger at anyone. It's been drawn up to try and show the way, because following the death of President Idriss Deby, the situation has become unstable. I'm of the firm conviction that the future lies not in taking up arms. Arms will not resolve the current problems in Chadian society, but dialogue, ladies and gentlemen. And given that, we've seen an encouraging signal that a transitional government has been appointed with the participation of a number of the opposition parties and civil society. And I think it is only a democratic path that will lead to a stable future for the Chadian people. Chad has to remain an important partner for the European Union, and we call on the international community to support Chad on its path to democracy and stability for the whole region. Thank you.
Danke sehr. Nächster Redner ist
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Saturi, 1 minute 30. Madam President, High Representative, the citizens of Chad, do they have a right to democracy? Do they have a right to the respect for the constitution of their country? If we believe the silence that some people are engaged in, then you'd get the impression that the answer is no. But the people of Chad have called for respect for their political rights on the streets with courage, with Déby, who's the son, who is just as brutal as his father. Mahamat Idris Déby is violating the constitution. He has no democratic legitimacy. Mahamat Idris Déby, through his coup d'etat in Chad, which seems to have been endorsed by the French government, will not have its government endorsed by the European Parliament. We condemn this military seizure of power. We condemn the violations of the Constitution and the setting up of a transitional government without democratic consent. We call for the holding of elections as rapidly as possible. We will be vigilant. We will ensure that Europe's diplomacy will ensure that our partners in Chad honour democratic values. We need to be proud to support a Europe of values when others are prepared to compromise. In the Greens group in this Parliament, we have also called for the seizure of the assets of the perpetrators of this coup d'etat. The EU needs to use all of the means at its disposal to protect democratic rights. Thank you.
Dankeschön.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Kanko for 1 minute.
Beste collega's.
Ladies and gentlemen, the death of President Idris Déby automatically has led to a time of more instability. Now, it is obvious that he has been violating human rights, but also at the same time he's been fighting jihadism in the region. Now, his son has taken over power, and we have to make sure that free and fair elections are made as soon as possible with international observers. The EU has to continue to support Chad in its fight against jihadism in the region, against radical Islam. But I'd like to be clear, the country cannot deny democratic rights. We cannot allow the Sahel to be a breeding ground for terrorism, because that will strike Europe as well. So we have to do more in the Sahel countries. We have to make sure that there's more attention paid to make sure that we take away this breeding ground from jihadists.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Urban Crespo for 1 minute.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. When President Idris Déby died, the army seized power and nominated Déby's son as president, a dynastic succession in a country that's supposed to be a republic. And what's Europe's response? Well, Mr. Borrell went to Chad to call for stability and to call also for the transition to be accomplished quickly. But what you're calling transition is what we call a coup d'etat, and what you call stability is something that we call a dictatorship. And that's why we're calling for the constitutional order to be re-established in Chad, for political power to be handed over to the civilian powers. We want free elections and an end to repression, and in the meantime, we do not want to see European funds or cooperation going to Chad, because condemning a coup d'etat shouldn't depend on whether the country is a political ally of ours or not. And it ought not to depend on the neo-colonial and geopolitical interests of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now on behalf of the political groups, we'll start with the EPP group, Mr. Bellamy. 1 minute.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the resolution that we've drawn up on Chad explains that terrorism that's been strafing this country because of climate change, exploitation of natural resources, the lack of economic and educational perspectives. How can we expect that terrorism, be it in N'Djamena, Paris, Vienna or anywhere, be acceptable? We have to see the link between cause and consequence wherever jihadists are in action. If you have no future prospects, how do you avoid violence, and how do you avoid Europe being, and always have been, a target for these murders? Now, I share the amendment that Arnaud Danjean has tabled to remind us of that. Europe has to move away from this denial. Jihadist violence is threatening French military. If you know this country, there are people there fighting to keep peace, and they are paying with their own blood. Since 2013, 55 French soldiers have died. This is a combat that affects us all, because the security and safety of Europe is being played out there in the Sahel, and we have to deploy forces against opponents who are determined and who want to destabilize the region. Let's not forget the role Turkey is playing here, for example, on the Libyan front of Chad. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to act together in the Sahel, but also here in the EU, against these threats which are a threat to democracy. Thank you.
Well, I think you've already had a lot more speaking time than you were originally allowed. Now, in any case, the next speaker is Mr. Zorrinho for 1 minute. Madam President, Commissioner, the President of Chad, death, I offer my condolences, and his replacement by his son as leading a transitional military council, suspending the constitution, banning demonstrations, and killing at least 6 people at the end of April. These are all motives enough to be concerned about events over the last few weeks in the Sahel. Chad has an important role in the stability of the Sahel, but we have endemic problems such as food insecurity and lack of economic opportunities. In this rather gloomy framework, we have the actions of Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups destabilizing the growth perspectives and development perspectives of the country. I call upon the authorities of Chad to work together with the international community to pursue a democratic transition through creating the conditions for legislative elections and presidential elections, respecting the constitution and minimum standards, and ensuring that the opposition and civil society are involved. Thank you very much, Mr. Zorrinho. On behalf.
Now for the Renew Group, Ms. Loiseau.
Si un pays est l'otage de sa géographie,
if a country is a hostage of its geography, if there's a country in that situation, well, Chad is one of those countries facing the region, jihadis, Boko Haram. For years now, Chad has been faced with violence, and its military and strategic importance is recognized by all as a member of the G5. But the country is faced with yet another military threat. Just look at FACT, the group that killed President Déby. And so we need to help this country that we're asking a lot of and that is facing too many threats. But the country's military importance is its strength and its weakness. There's simply no way to seize power through sheer strength. And for too long, people thought that an authoritarian regime was what was needed to keep the country orderly. But I would call on Europe and the African Union and all the people of Chad to show that the opposite is true, that through openness and inclusivity, Chad's opposition will succeed. In Chad, as elsewhere, the military's role is to serve the state, not to take its place. Thank you.
Dankeschön.
Thank you very much. Now for the ECR group, Ms. Wisniewska for 1 minute.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, Chad is one of the most corrupt and poorest countries in the world. After the death of the president, it is the army that took over. The constitution was suspended, the government and the parliament were dissolved. Democratic protests were quelled violently. Chad is fighting with terrorism in the region. The region is unstable and threatened by Islamic terrorism, organized crime, and famine. So there is a dilemma what to do. Stability or democracy. But without democracy, it is not possible to maintain stability. Lack of democratic mandate is encouraging terrorist groups that want to exploit public discontent. So we should renew our attitude. We cannot think that it is the Europeans that know better what Africa needs.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, Mr. Kelly, for 1 minute.
Commissioner, the killing of President Deby, allegedly at the hands of rebels in the north of the country, will have undeniable regional repercussions. This act of violence and the recent further loss of life in attacks by armed groups in the region needs to be strongly and collectively condemned by this House. I join colleagues in concern over the volatile security situation in the north of the country, but we must also send a strong signal that the repeated breaches of human rights and humanitarian law is not acceptable, and the international community needs to make this clear. Corruption, political exclusion, growing disparity and repression of dissent were trademarks of President Deby's rule in Chad. However, unless these grievances are addressed, Chad's instability can be expected to persist, particularly as it has regional repercussions given Chad's strategic location. Violence and intimidation cannot produce an inclusive and fair society, and we should make our voices loud and clear in reiterating this as many times as is necessary.
Thank
you very much. Mr. Hetman will conclude this debate for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. April, the president of Chad died in the struggle with the rebels. Under this president, this country was important for the stability of the region. He was engaging in the anti-jihadist operation, who was fighting with extremists. We can say that the stability, political stability of Chad is important for the region. Chad there will be change in this country, and how they will happen. It will be a test for this country and will shape the country for the decades to come. Now it's very important to organize open, transparent presidential election. Both organization of the election and any activities before that election should be carried out within the constitutional order. Also, the freedom of speech, the human rights should be always respected, and it cannot happen that people are arrested or violence against protesters, peaceful protesters. The European Union should support the efforts of the African Union to stabilize the situation in Chad. Thank you very much.
Danke sehr.
Thank you very much. Now, on behalf of the Commission.
Mr. President, honourable members of the European Parliament, as many of you have said, and your resolution also points out, and it's important to underline, that the Chad plays an important role in the fight against terrorism within the G5 Sahel group, and we need to preserve the territorial integrity and stability of Chad in the fragile security context of the region. The region is the Sahel region, and the Sahel remains very high in the European agenda. It's one of the regions of the world where the Union and its member states are most committed to peace, stability and development. Between 2014 and 2020, we have provided 8.5 billion in development and humanitarian aid, security and defence. This is why the European Union decided to adopt a renewed Sahel strategy on the mid of April, and why I chose this moment to make my first visit to the region in 2024. I took this opportunity to convey a clear message to all the leaders of the region. The European Union is engaged to support them in the essential fight against terrorism that is paramount for all of us, but our collective commitment needs to be a fruit, needs to deliver. And that's why we have engaging with more than 1,000 people in our military and civilian CSDP missions in Sahel, in Mali, in Niger, and also the EU training mission in Mali that now is going to expand its activities to other countries in the region. And that's why also some member states with others are participating in this effort, for example, with the anti-terrorist task force in Takuba. However, and many of you have also said that, even with not the same words, that we will not collectively succeed in the fight if we don't win the peace, while we intend to win the war. We will not win the war without winning the peace. This is all the sense of the civilian surge decided at Jamena Summit last February. And I want to stress the importance of this commitment. It's not only a matter of war, it's a matter of good governance and deployment of the capacities of the governments over the territory in order to provide with the basic public goods to the population. As I said, after the approval of our strategy for the region, and when I was about to visit Sahel, it happened the death of President Deby of Chad, April 20. So, being in the region, I decided to visit Chad, not only to attend the funeral, but also, as I said in my speech in the very same funeral, that we have to take this opportunity to convey a message to the Chadian authorities and to the African leaders who were present on this ceremony. First, to recognize the contribution of Chad to the fight against terrorism, and this contribution is essential, as I said at the beginning, so much it is the Chad stability. Indeed, President Deby's death was quickly followed by a military takeover by the military junta. And the situation remains evolving rapidly, and future developments are difficult to predict. Just before coming here, I've been having a meeting with the President of Niger, in visit here in Brussels, and had the opportunity to exchange with him views about this situation and learn from him which can be the prospects. For us, Europeans, and for all countries in the region, this is a major source of concern because the effective and necessary involvement of Chadian troops in the G5 joint forces and the fight against terrorism on the Lake Chad. But, as I clearly stated during my eulogy, my intervention in the funeral, while the stability of the child remains paramount, we need a genuine, inclusive dialogue as a necessary step towards a renewed social contract in Chad too. I also declared there and reiterated in my latest statement the importance of a swift return to constitutional order, and that the political transition must be civilian-led. And it was a good news that the military junta decided some days after to nominate a civilian as prime minister. That this transition has to be limited in time and peaceful. And unhappily, there has been events with regrettable casualties among civilians that doesn't follow this peaceful requirement. It should respect human rights and fundamental freedoms and lead to credible elections. Credible elections. The military authorities nominated a government, which includes some opposition representatives. They indicated their will to engage in an inclusive dialogue. As I said, they nominated a civilian prime minister. Still, demonstrations against the military junta were put down by force, and there are reports of civil society organizations and political opponents being harassed by the state security services. We, the European Union, have strongly condemned this repression of demonstrations in Chad. And we are talking to all stakeholders, including representatives of the opposition and of civil society, to convey our key messages and to listen to their concerns. Let me finally stress that a close cooperation with the United Nations and the African Union remains important. The latter had a mission in Chad to evaluate the situation, and the African Union Peace and Security Council is expected to come with recommendations for the transition. Certainly, dear members, this is a difficult moment in Chad history, but it is also a potential threat for our strategy to fight terrorism in the region. But it is also an opportunity, as we say here in Europe those days, to build back better, to build a new social contract in Chad that should serve to meet the numerous aspirations of the population and to address the root causes of instability of the country, including certainly lack of democratization, lack of good governance, and full respect to human rights. We will be ready to accompany Chad in that direction, but we need to see a clear commitment by the authorities to go along that path. And I am going to use this opportunity here from the tribune of the European Parliament to reiterate this message. Thank you.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. That concludes this debate. The vote will be held today. We're going to suspend the sitting now. It will resume at 1 p.m. with the announcement of the results of today's first voting session. Thank you.
Die Sitzung ist wieder aufgenommen.
The sitting is resumed. I'll now move on to the results of the first voting session of today. The results of the first voting session are the following. Amendments on the joint resolution to the situation in Haiti. Para 16 of the original amendment carried. On the situation in Chad, Amendment 8 rejected, Amendment 1 rejected, Amendment 9 rejected, Amendment 2 rejected, Amendment 3 rejected, Amendment 4 rejected, Amendment 5 rejected, Amendment 10 rejected, Amendment 11 rejected, Amendment 7 carried, Amendment 6 rejected. Amendments on Mr. Dolezal's report. Environment, the Aarhus Regulation. Amendment from the Leeds Committee in en bloc, carried. Amendment 24 first part, carried. Amendment 24 second part, carried. Amendment 23, carried. Amendment 40, falls. Amendment 46, rejected. Amendment 45, rejected. Amendment 38D, rejected. Amendment 27, carried. Amendment 42, rejected. Amendment 39, rejected. Amendment 41, rejected. Amendment 31, carried. Amendment 43, rejected. Amendment 5, carried. Amendment 36D, rejected. Amendment 37, rejected. Amendment 10, carried. Amendment 47, rejected. Amendments on the joint motion for resolution on Chinese counter-sanctions against the EU and MEPs and national MPs. Amendment 4 rejected. Amendment 15 rejected. I could say all are rejected, could I? Or do I have to read them all out? Okay, I'll read them all out. Amendment 5 rejected. Amendment 6 rejected. Amendment 7 rejected. Amendment 8 rejected. Amendment 9 rejected. 18 rejected. Amendment 17 rejected. Amendment 18 rejected. Amendment 19 rejected. Amendment 10 rejected. Amendment 20 rejected. Amendment 21D rejected. Amendment 22 rejected. Amendment 1 rejected. Amendment 2 rejected. Amendment 3 rejected. Amendment 11 rejected. Amendment 12 rejected. Amendment 13 rejected. Amendment 14 rejected. The amendments to the motion for resolution, Data Protection Commissioner versus Facebook Ireland Limited, Max Milman Schrems 2. Amendment 1 rejected. Paragraph 4 first part carried. Paragraph 4 second part carried. Paragraph 19 first part carried. Paragraph 19 second part carried. Paragraph 19 third part carried. Paragraph 20 original text carried. Paragraph 30 original text carried. Paragraph 31 first part carried. Paragraph 31 first part carried. Second part carried. Recital A original text carried. Recital E original text carried. Recital L original text carried. Motions for resolutions on the adequate protection of personal data by the United Kingdom. Amendment from the EPP and the ECR rejected. Now, pursuant to Rule 59, Para 4, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Dolezal on the referral back to Committee of Institutional Negotiations of his report, Environment, the Aarhus Regulation. Mr. Dolezal, you have the floor for 1 minute, and this request will be put to the vote after the vote on the Commission's proposal.
Herzlichen Dank. Following the vote that has taken place on the Aarhus dossier today, I would like to request that the matter committee responsible for institutional negotiation pursuant to Rule 59. Thank you very much.
Dankeschön.
Thank you very much. The sitting suspended. It will resume at 1:45 with the opening of the second voting session.